What do you think, Beth? Should I get started? Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I'm really excited to have this presentation happen and to see quite a few of you out here to listen about the Protected Agricultural Lands Database. I'm going to start off first. My name is Ryan Murphy. I'm the GIS manager at American Farmland Trust. I've got Shradha Shrestha with us here. She's the GIS Technician at American Farmland Trust and involved in putting the PALD or Protected Agricultural Lands Database together. I have Beth Frazier on the line, who is the National Agricultural Land Network and Affiliates Manager and helping us manage the conversation today. And also Chris Coffin, the National Agricultural Land Network Director and Senior Policy Advisor at American Farmland Trust, who will be sharing with you all about the National Agricultural Land Network at the end of the presentation here. Some more housekeeping. We'll start off with an overview. We'll jump into the presentation. And we're going to have some ample time for questions and discussion at the end. So we have the chat going. If you have questions and you think of them during the presentation, please use the chat to jot them down, and we'll answer those at the end as they in the order they came in at. And please, because we have a large group, please keep yourself muted if you can and until the end of the presentation. So with that, I will get started. We've got a presentation for you on the ins and outs and the kind of origination and development of the Protected Agricultural Lands Database from American Farmland Trust. I'm going to pass it to Shradha to give you a little bit of an overview about what the Protected Agricultural Lands Database is.
Thanks, Ryan, for the introduction and overview. Let's get started with a brief introduction of Protected Agricultural Lands Database, or PAL. It is FT's comprehensive and ongoing effort to map our nationwide protected agricultural land, including Alaska and Hawaii. Our database contains boundaries and also attribute information about permanently protected farmland and ranchland. Our database includes compiled data from federal, state, and regional protected area inventories, state and local base programs, and land trusts. Additionally, it integrates data from available resources like U.S. Protected Areas Database, or PAD-US, NRCS easement programs, and National Conservation Easement Database, or ANSED. This work is supported by USDA and NRCS funding. On the right, we have an interactive map showing a cluster of easements. The bigger circles have higher acres of easements and vice versa. If we click on each cluster, we get pop-up showing total acres covered by easements. Zooming more closely, we can see individual easement with description of some of the important attributes like site name, date of establishment, total acres, easement holder name, owner type, etc. And this map is also available for public viewing. Next slide, please, Ryan. Thank you. Now we'll talk about why is the PAL needed. Currently, there is no nationwide database for spatial data on protected ag lands. Talking about the AFT-specific uses, it informs AFT's Farm Under Threat and Land Use Protection Initiative research. Also, it complements AFT's Farmland Information Center to survey base and land trusts, supporting its ag land conservation effort. Later in the presentation, Ryan will be sharing example maps of PAL uses in various projects within AFT. The PAL adds value to an existing resources. For example, the existing database like ANSED and other protected ag land database with nationwide coverage don't always identify protected lands as agricultural. In this case, our PAL database integrates with available database to provide tailored agricultural protection information. The PAL is also useful in prioritizing agricultural lands for conservation. Another importance is it improves understanding of successful cases and identifies or analyzes gaps or challenges in ag land protection effort at a local level, which helps in future planning and sustainability. These are the few key points highlighting the significance of the PAL resource. Now, Ryan will talk about the PAL data integration and QA/QC steps.
Sure, thanks, Shradha. So I'll give you a really brief overview of some of the methods we use to put this resource together. Probably the least interesting slide that you see here to the right is sort of the structure, or in GIS or technical speak, the schema of the database. Those who are familiar with the National Conservation Easement Database may see a lot of similarities here, and that's by design. We started with their structure. We added some additional fields that we were specifically interested in, and we wanted to design this resource to both integrate information from the NSED and also from the PAD US, or Protected Areas Database, and also to be shared with those efforts at a future date. So some of our first steps, we paired this effort, the data collection effort, with the Farmland Information Center surveys of state and local PACE programs and land trusts. They do yearly and every 5 years, I believe, for land trust, yearly surveys for state and local PACE programs that assess acreage and new easements with each survey. And we added some questions related to the spatial information, spatial data, and boundary data that was sent out with those surveys, so that we could combine our collection efforts. It also, as Shradha mentioned earlier, integrates with other protected lands inventories, and it includes information on federal ag protection programs directly from the NRCS, ASAP-BALE, and FRPP are examples. We then fit this information that comes from a variety of sources to the standard data structure that includes some of the key attributes and important information we're interested in. I mentioned earlier that it both integrates and aligns with the National Conservation Easement Database by design. The next step would be cleaning and quality assessing the information we receive. As those who work with this information know, it comes in a range of quality and it comes in a range of structures. So we have to kind of figure out the way to push it into a standardized format. We've developed some workflows to do that, standardizing some of the field or column information and some of the attributes that are associated with each easement. And we also, sometimes we receive information from entities that inventory protected lands data in general, or protected lands areas in general. And in this case, we're only interested in agricultural easements. So we take that information and remove non-agricultural lands. And then we calculate acreage totals. We do our standardization and cleaning workflow, and we calculate acreage based on the boundaries on the ground. An important point I want to mention is that we really value landowner, manager, and operator privacy. Any data provider who gives us this information, we ask whether they are okay with the boundary layers being shared publicly. And if they're not, we have a flag that allows us to summarize that information at the state level, but withhold the boundaries from public viewing. There's also an option for these areas to be viewable, but not downloadable for other individuals. And finally, a third option, just available for public sharing. Next, after these following steps, we summarize and share a public version. As we'll see in a moment here, we have summary statistics of the data set at a state level, state and national level. And we also have publicly available layers, both on the web and available by request. I do want to mention some important limitations to the PALD effort. One is that we have limited ability and knowledge of being able to clean the actual boundaries themselves or adjust the boundaries themselves. The sources of information that provide us with this data, we respect their accuracy on the ground in determining the boundaries, and we don't have the capacity to adjust boundaries to any sort of parcel standard at the moment. I did mention that some of the information is withheld from the public data source, but it all is included in the state level summaries of the information. We do know that there are overlaps within the Protected Agricultural Lands database. This is partially by design, depending on where we receive the information. There may be an overlap that we should maintain where we're managing data from different programs and also maybe from the landowner or land trust themselves. And we want to maintain that to be viewable, but also to keep it separate so that we can better calculate some summary information based on those boundaries. And finally, not all of the information, because of the wide range of sources that we've been collecting from, is available for all of the easements within the PALD. Some entities just manage the boundary information alone, and they don't provide too many additional pieces of detail or attributes along with the boundaries. And we still accept that because it's important to know where the protected easement is on the ground, even if we can't necessarily know everything we want to know about each individual easement. So with that summary of the methods, I'll pass it to Shradha to talk about some key benefits of this effort.
Thank you, Ryan. And EFT and other users can use the PAL data in many different ways. Some of the key benefits are to promote and measure the successes of an existing ag land protection efforts nationwide, inform future ag land protection efforts, also provide spatial and attribute information to researchers, quantify ecosystem services derived from permanently protected ag lands, assist ag land protection organizations by providing standardized inventory of spatial data. We can also summarize important characteristics of each protected ag land parcels like soil, crop, and growing condition, which may be useful in analyzing soil health status, nutrient management, and crop yield statistics, etc. On the right, we can see protected ag lands in New Jersey, one of the states with highest space acres. So after discussing about few advantages, we'll now move into important summary stats discussion. Next slide, please. Thank you. Currently, in our database, we have data of over 7 million acres of land within 42,000 parcel or features. Out of these, over 30,000 records are publicly available. We gathered data and information from around 650 easement holders and 400 different data sources. In this database, over 2 million acres are identified as space program easements. 60,000 acres are NRCS agricultural land protection program easements. On the right, we can see a snip of protected ag lands in Pennsylvania. It shows how a protection of farmland restricts future urban expansion, thereby protecting loss of green spaces there. Next slide, please. So here is a map showing distribution of protected ag lands by state. The top 5 states with highest PAL acres are Colorado, Montana, Pennsylvania, California, and Virginia. These summary stats map are interactive and clickable, where you can get acreage, total acreage, state acreage information from there. And next we have a map showing distribution of PACE program easements by states. The top 5 states with highest PACE acres are Colorado again, Maryland, New Jersey, Vermont, and Delaware. Both of these summary stats map will be available to the public. Our stats reflect what we gather at our PAL database, not necessarily all protected ag lands in the US. Now, Ryan will be taking over to explain how can we utilize this PAL resources.
Thanks, Shradha. So I'll walk us through some of the ways that we've used the Protected Agricultural Lands database, some of the ways you can use it, and some of the ways we plan to use it in this year's work and into the future. So as we mentioned before, this whole effort emerged from the Farms Under Threat project and a need to accurately identify protected agricultural land on the ground so that we could then better assess development impacts to the agricultural land base. We did some work in the first phase of Farms Under Threat that we called State of the States, identifying areas that have been converted, areas of agricultural land converted to urban and high density and low density residential land use. And the need for the PAL became apparent when we were doing this work, because we wanted to ensure that we didn't mistakenly identify areas as having been converted or increasing in development intensity that were actually permanently protected as agricultural easements. And I share this slide as just as a reminder to all of us that we're doing this large scale work. And while we did not have the Protected Agricultural Lands database available immediately upon doing it, and here we have in red, our agricultural land conversion layer, and in green with crosshatches, the Protected Agricultural Lands layer. And you can see in the this kind of center right of the map here that there's some areas where these two overlap. So the PAL can help us more accurately assess this historic conversion. This is an image of protected agricultural lands near Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. So in the second phase, if you will, of our Farms Under Threat work, we looked at projecting agricultural land conversion to these two developed land uses, urban and highly developed, and low density residential, out into the future under 3 different development scenarios. You can find more about this work at the link here. And just as a reminder, I'll share links with everyone on this call after the presentation. In order to do this, we again use the Protected Agricultural Land database to inform our projections under these 3 development scenarios. We also conducted an interesting experiment or 4th scenario where we projected a future scenario where resources and policy for farmland protection enabled a drastic increase of protected agricultural land on the ground. And that's what you can see in the map here. We have down at the bottom here, the existing farmland protection directly from the Protected Agricultural Lands database. And we have in the light purple violet, our projected farmland protection that we created based on suitability for protection that included agricultural land quality and potential threat of conversion to a more developed land use. And this is the Madison-Milwaukee corridor in Wisconsin. Another use case we mentioned is looking at prioritizing lands for future agricultural protection. And one of the criteria that many use is where is existing or current agricultural protection in relation to lands that could be further protected. We have an example here in the north of Vermont, Ferrisburg, where we have a sort of a buffer or a 1 mile distance looking at how much agricultural land has been protected around a potential future agricultural land easement. So where it gets really fun for mapping nerds like me is when we start to combine some of the protected agricultural lands data with other information that American Farmland Trust has produced and other information that's out there in the world. Our State of the States work, our Farms Under Threat Phase 1, created a Productivity, Versatility, and Resiliency, or PVR Index, which provides a continuous metric of agricultural land quality. And we can use this to overlay with the PALD to look at what the quality of existing protected lands are and where the highest quality lands that aren't protected are located. And so we have the darker green here is actually agricultural land that has a higher PVR index score. And this is in Massachusetts, Deerfield. And we have some areas that have been well protected and then other areas that could be prioritized for protection. Obviously, that depends on a whole suite of other factors as well. Another option is looking at soil quality and important farmland soils from the NRCS. This might be more familiar to many of you. We have prime farmland as a classification, and that identifies some of the better soils for growing food and crops. And you can see again the PALD in white here and lots of areas of prime farmland that have yet to be permanently protected, as well as plenty of areas that have already been protected. You could also imagine using these two pieces of information to find what proportion each easement is prime farmland or farmland of statewide importance or other. And as I mentioned previously, with Farms Under Threat research, we've created historic development conversion layers and also projected developed land uses out into the future. And we can look at where this development impact might be the greatest and also where a need for protection might be the greatest by combining those two. In red here, we have historic conversion to urban and highly developed and low density residential land uses and the protected agricultural lands database. You could also imagine looking at this in the context of energy development and where solar or other energy suitability interfaces with the agricultural land database, and where you may want to protect the highest quality lands in some areas and use other lesser quality lands to develop renewable energy. That's just a few options. There's so much more that could be done with this. We've talked about and have done in some pilot projects summaries of different land covers of interest within the Protected Agricultural Lands database. Forests, for example, has interesting implications when we talk about climate change and the potential greenhouse gas mitigation potential of these protected easements. We've also looked at farm size of protected lands and what size farms tend to be protected at a higher rate. I talked about protected lands and energy or solar development, and of course, so much more. So we talked about what we've done a little bit in the past, what we can do with all of the resources at our disposal, and I'll talk a little bit about what we plan to do and hope to do in the future. So the first version of the Protected Agricultural Lands database is now available to the public. We have a public-facing website I'll show you in a moment, and we have a interactive web map and lots of different ways to use to look at and assess this resource. So that said, the Protected Agricultural Lands database is not complete. We're getting close in some states, and in some areas we have known gaps. We want to further identify state and local PACE properties as one step to improve the database. We also want to target these gaps, remaining land trusts and state agricultural protection programs that have not yet been included. We want to improve some of the attribution or detail that comes along with each easement. And of course, there's always cleaning and quality assessment and control that can be improved upon. So some projects this year that are going to incorporate the PALDs in one way or another. We have a project with funding from the NRCS on ecosystem services and conservation benefit on NRCS Agricultural Conservation Easement Program easements and Farm and Ranch Land Protection Program easements, where we're going to overlay the PALD with some work that has been done on identifying some of these ecosystem benefits in across the country. We also want to do storytelling about the protected agricultural efforts that are going on across the country. And one of the projects that we have slated for this year is develop some story maps and some multimedia presentations of FRPP landowners and how, where, and why they're protecting the lands that they do. And finally, I mentioned previously that we can look at the potential greenhouse gas mitigation from protected agricultural lands when you compare it with different developed land uses. We recently are wrapping up a pilot project in Illinois to do that work, and we're going to expand that across the country. The Protected Agricultural Lands database will be a part of that project, looking at where current land is protected. So with that, I want to share a little bit about how to access these resources. I mentioned that the first version is available to the public. For the GIS and mapper folks out there, we have this information in the geodatabase or GDB and shapefile formats available. We also have an interactive web map, some of what you saw, and we will also have a web service for those of us who want to add this as a layer to our own web maps. And to access this information, aside from the web map that's already I'll provide a link to you, and it's already public. You can send us an email at maps@farmland.org, to request it. We also have the farms under threat layers. I mentioned a number of them: the productivity, versatility, and resilience layer, the agricultural land conversion, historic conversion and future scenario projections, and a lot more. And I will send links after the presentation to everyone who registered about where to find those as well. Much of this is already available publicly for those who request it. And I want to make a plug for the Farmland Information Center, a great resource for everyone interested in agricultural land protection. There is a page on the Farmland Information Center for the Protected Agricultural Lands database. There's some basic information about the PAL, that much of which we went over in the presentation today. You can access the web map here, also viewable in full screen, and zoom around and explore yourself and find some more key points about the PALD, and also our contact information if you want to provide additions, share comments, or request the data. There's also a lot of great information here in general for landowners, farmers and beginning farmers, policymakers and professionals, planners and local professional officials, to name a few. And with that, I will pass it to Chris, who will talk to you a little bit about the National Agricultural Land Network. Chris, I believe you're muted.
Sorry about that. So thank you, Ryan. That was terrific. I wanted to take a minute to just make sure that folks who are on this event are aware of the National Agricultural Land Network. I've looked through the participant list, and I'm happy that I recognize many of you and that you are current network members. All of you, if you have joined, would be folks who we think would benefit from the network. Essentially, the network is an information and peer learning network for those who are working to save agricultural land. And that is, when we talk about saving agricultural land from the AFT perspective, it's about permanent farmland protection, but it's about less than that. It is about good planning and zoning that can help to retain agricultural land. It is about farm viability efforts that can help to improve profitability. So for all of you on the call, please, we hope that you will check out the network, that you will consider joining it. It is free. I always like to say that the network is only as good as members in it. And so we are looking for additional members. We have 850-ish at the moment, but welcome many more folks. And you can see we have an online community platform. We have monthly network news, newsletters, electronic newsletters. We have a series of workshops and other events. So please do check us out. We hope people will consider joining. And again, importantly, there is no cost to join. So with that, and my infomercial right there, let's get to questions. And I think Ryan and Shradha, you guys answered the first one, which is how this information is going to be made available. And it's obviously clear that it will be made available in a number of different ways, and appreciate knowing all of that. The next question was about, it was specific, I think, to Ryan when you showed the two farms under threat data layers. I think you first showed from farms under threat, state of the states, and the historic land conversion. And then you showed one with the modeled potential land conversion from farms under threat 2040. the question, and I think it referred to the historic ag land conversion image that you showed, is what is the time frame of that ag land conversion layer?
So we assess between 2001 and 2016 time periods, that conversion. So anything that was agriculture in 2001 and became one of these developed land uses, urban and highly developed and low density residential, we counted as converted.
Great.
The second time period was 2016.
Great, 2016 to 2040. Right, on that modeling.
The modeling, yes,
conversion.
the projected modeling was 2016 to 2040.
Great. Okay, so moving on, there was a question about who holds the easements. This question number 1, and 2, does the call include land enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program?
That is a good question. So there's a variety of land holders and land managing entities, from public to private, and from state funded to held by a private land trust. And it does not include lands in the CRP program.
Right, because those are not permanently protected agricultural land. And I think, Ryan, you did say on the who holds the easement that if you hover over an easement, in some cases it will say who the easement holder is.
That's one of the pieces of information we receive most frequently. So if we've received it, then it will show when you click on an easement, who holds the easement and who's managing the easement.
Great.
As well as whether it's part of a state or local PACE program.
Great. The next question is financial data included, like what the appraised cost per acre was?
Not at the moment. We have kind of a subset of the details that we include with each easement. Sometimes we've received information that's built off of a parcel layer that does include that piece of detail, but for the most cases, we don't include it. One of the many potential things we could do is match this with a parcel data set that does include some of those actual land value metrics.
Right. Okay, that sounds fascinating. Next question is, what are AFT's plans for keeping this database updated?
That is also a great question. This database effort has been sort of a long time coming. I think we've now worked on it for over 3 years and just getting out to the version, we're calling it version 1 as the publicly shareable version. A number of the projects I mentioned include funding in some way for the Protected Agricultural Lands database, so we'll continue to update it, but we're also pursuing additional resources to do a second large update and also to keep it updated in the future as well.
Great, thanks. And I would just make a plug on behalf of AFT, is that if folks are finding this useful, to write in some way or let us know any testimonials about how this is being used and is useful will help us, obviously, in continuing to seek funding for updates for it. Next question, and this is a regional one, so I assume that you may not know this, Ryan or Shradha. Do you know if there are plans to integrate this data into the Washington State Columbia Plateau least conflict solar siting process? Any idea, or is that a question for our regional office that we can be back in touch with them, the questioner on that one?
No idea currently, Chris.
Okay.
But thanks for the question, and it's an interesting idea. If that opportunity exists, I think it would be a great way to use the PALD.
Right. So, John, and I don't, your last name, Belak, answered who said that he's working on that solar siting process would be great. So that I think what we should do is just have our Pacific Northwest folks follow up, because they probably know that already. And thank you. Oh, that's a different answer. So we will be in touch and reach out about that specifically. Let me get to a few more questions. How were organizations contacted to ask about contributing data? We share, this is from Chris Ray with Finger Lakes Land Trust. We share with NSED and have sent data to AFT in the past, but it doesn't appear that their easements are on the PALD web map. Thoughts on if there are other folks in that boat as well, as what's the way to be in touch and provide that data?
Sorry, I missed where that question was from. If there's
Finger Lakes Land Trust, which I assume is New York State, would be my guess.
Yeah, so there's a couple of reasons why you may not see it, and I'm not sure off the top of my head whether this applies, but one is that we have only the publicly shareable information viewable on the web map currently. So if there was a need to keep it private or even non-downloadable, it may not be currently on the web map. We did make some updates in New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia that we plan to push to the web map, to the public facing version, but haven't done that yet. So those areas could be in that bucket as well. And we grab everything that's identified as open space farmland or open space rangeland from the NSED, the National Conservation Easement Database. So ideally, if it was in the NSED and tagged as one of those two uses, we would have it. But please do reach out to us, and I know that Land Trust, and I do believe we have their data. So if it's not on the web map and it's available for public sharing, then we should get it on there.
Right. And so we have another, I'm seeing chats also from Becky Hootenga with Ottawa County, Michigan, saying that their local PACE properties don't show up, and Clallam, Michelle Canali with in Clallam County, Washington, and also Jefferson County, Washington. So I think there are lots of questions about whether this data, right, is it because it's being withheld and not downloadable, or whether it is missing. So I guess, Ryan, for folks who are identifying places where they're not seeing things, is the thing to be in touch with you and Shradha to follow up on it?
Yeah, please do. I will say we do have information that we know where there's known gaps, and we hope to fill them. We have a little bit of a backlog of data that has not been added. And we also know that the PALD is not complete in all areas, either because we haven't received the information or we didn't receive it identified explicitly as agricultural land. There are several reasons for those gaps. So that's one of the really great reasons to do this presentation, is to better identify those gaps on the ground.
Right, yeah. Exactly. So let me get to a last few questions. One, thank you for a great presentation. Could you talk a bit more about the implications of the data overlaps you mentioned?
How much time do I have? No.
A minute, because we have several other questions still.
The implications, they could range. I think one is looking at prioritizing lands for future protection in some of the ways I discussed, based on some of these layers that we have that identify the highest quality agricultural lands, either at the state level or at the national level. And we can overlay the protected areas with those lands to see which of the highest quality lands are not protected, and perhaps it might be of interest to prioritize those lands for future protection efforts.
Right. Okay, great. Yes, there are lots of uses that are terrific here. Here's a question from California. Are any term-based agricultural protections being considered for inclusion, or only easements that are presumed to be permanent?
That's a good question, and I think we've bounced around on that question a little bit. We do and have collected term-based information. Right now, I think the public information only has permanently protected lands, but we're considering, I think it's important to keep track and to know at a spatial level where those easements are that are term-based also. It may be a separate effort or an addition, and there are people at AFT who know a lot more about that than I do. So,
right, because I can imagine both at the federal level, getting back to that question about CRP, obviously those are term easements, but there are a number of different state programs. I'm thinking of Williamson Act in California. I'm thinking about Massachusetts and its farm viability program that have sort of covenants and term easements. So I think that's a really good question. And one to explore further. There is, hang on, one question which it sounds like there might be an issue with sharing permissions and or identifying lands as agriculture within NSAID. Is that the case?
I don't want to speak for the folks who manage NSAID. They put out a great resource, but I think those two issues are there. That similar to our effort, NSAID, I believe, collects information, that doesn't always have all of the attributes that they would like to have. So they have some protected areas in their database that are agricultural easements, but that are not identified as such. And the permissions issue, I think, is another issue that they've handled in a similar way, where they provide state level summary statistics, but they can't provide all of the easement or protected area boundaries with the public for issues of privacy.
Great. Okay. We have one more question, and we do have a little bit more time. So if anybody else has last questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat. We have a comment and a question from Kent Wimmer, who I'm guessing is from Florida, because Kent says the partners of the Northwest Florida Sentinel landscape have identified the challenge of conversion of forest and ag land to industrial scale solar farms. TNC Georgia has developed a solar siting tool to provide guidance to solar developers to guide them to areas with less regulatory and environmental constraints. We have begun conversations with partners in Florida. So that was, Kent was talking about this effort by TNC in Georgia and developing a solar siting tool. Kent is saying we have begun conversations with partners in Florida and other Southeast states about developing a similar tool. Thank you for sharing your protected ag land database, which I will encourage our partners to include to steer solar development away. Has AFT developed any similar solar siting tools?
solar siting specifically, I know we've had several states that have looked at prioritizing agricultural land protection in the context of solar development. And I do know that we have a project this year of perhaps including, well, the PALD would be a great resource, but also the Productivity, Versatility, and Resilience Index to identify some of the agricultural land of lesser quality, you know, at the state and national levels that overlaps with high suitability for solar development, and targeting that for a solar siting tool. Chris, do you know anything more about that effort? Or
well, I do know, and I would encourage folks who are land trusts that have access to the LTA rally materials from this past September, that there was an excellent presentation that Ethan Winter from AFT was part of that talked quite a bit about solar siting and mapping. And again, I think that was with TNC in terms of trying to look at maps and combine efforts around solar siting mapping. We can ask more, and Kent, we can be back in touch with you and link you up with Ethan and our other solar folks to get more information on that. So we will be happy to do that. And then one more question, Ryan, which was back from Laura, who had the question about the data overlaps. Laura says it was actually in reference to the overlaps mentioned in the data limitations section, because again, you said that this is an important limitation, is that there is overlapping data. And I think Laura is asking, can you explain a bit more about why and how these overlaps present limitations in using the data?
yeah, the main one that I can think of that we've faced, because we're collecting this information across a range of sources, sometimes we want to keep the boundary information from, let's say, a state Department of Ag or PACE program, but also from a land trust who's managing the easement directly. And there may be some overlaps there. Sometimes the actual boundary information may have some error to it. But in terms of the overlap implications, I was getting more at when we try to get a sense of overall acreage in the resource, and also acreage that is part of a particular program or maybe managed by a particular entity. We want to consider those overlaps when we're kind of summing it up to a higher level, either a state summary or a national summary. And so we've developed ways in our workflow to account for that. We also flag as much as we can those areas where there are overlaps, so that someone who grabbed this data from us could do the same thing.
Oh, that's great. Let me just make sure that I understand it then, because I think this would help others. Is, for example, if funding was used by a state PACE program for farmland protection projects funded in part through the federal Ag Conservation Easement Program, that might have been done in conjunction with a state PACE program and potentially also co-held by a land trust, that could conceivably show up in three different points of data for the same acreage. And what you were saying is that we've got a way of being able to identify where those where that happens, correct?
Exactly right. Okay. So 3 different sources could all be smushed on top of each other on the map, but we have a way to account for that in the summaries that we do with this information. And we may not want to where the boundaries are exactly identical for those three different sources, we can actually just merge the details into one. But where the boundaries are kind of mismatching a little bit and we're not sure which has the best accuracy, sometimes we want to keep those in order to have a better accounting of the summary information that each particular program or source may be managing.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you for that, Ryan. Those are all of the questions that I see. So I guess I should turn it back to you and Shradha for the sort of any final thoughts on your end.
Yeah, so thank you to everyone who's in attendance here. Great to see a lot of interest and a lot of questions. Thanks, Chris and Beth, for helping and for the explanation of the noun. I do want to plug some resources, but we're going to share some links after the call with folks who were here about how to access the data, where to get to the Farmland Information Center page, the noun network, and some of the other layers that we talked about, the other data layers we talked about. I also want to say, yeah, it's really useful for us to have so many people looking at the PAL database in order to point out those gaps and improve it in the future. So your input is really valuable, and send us an email with questions, thoughts, additional data. We're happy to hear from you. So thank you very much. Take care, everybody.